It started innocently enough. At first, I barely noticed him. The way he slid little comments into group conversations, the subtle digs that were always framed as jokes. You know the type. Charming, self-assured, the guy everyone laughs with, and yet somehow, consistently, it was at your expense. He wasn't malicious in the obvious way. He never outright insulted anyone. Instead, he had this knack for turning ordinary moments into subtle little power plays. And for nearly a year, I became his favorite target. In group hangouts, birthdays, dinners, or casual Friday nights at someone's apartment, he had a routine. He'd make a small, seemingly harmless joke. "Yeah, don't ask him, he'll turn that into a whole theory." Or, "Careful, he's taking it too seriously." The kind of line that would get a quick laugh from the group and instantly put me on the defensive. The trick wasn't the words themselves, it was the reaction he could provoke. He thrived on it. I quickly realized that these comments weren't about humor. They weren't about teasing lightly or even camaraderie. They were about eliciting a reaction, about getting that tiny little rush when everyone else laughed at your expense. After that first night of testing the waters, I realized something important. The power dynamic wasn't just about him being funny, it was about everyone else's participation. Every eye roll, every laugh, every little cringe gave him fuel. He thrived on it. And the more I ignored or dissected his comments, the more obvious it became that his humor only existed because I let it exist. So I decided to treat every future interaction as an experiment. Not a social battle, not a fight, just observation and precision. Every time he tried one of his signature jokes, I answered literally. No anger, no awkward laughter, no sarcasm, just slow, methodical clarification. For example, at a small Friday night game gathering, he leaned over, smirk in place. "Careful, don't let him overanalyze the rules again. We know how that goes." Normally, that would have been enough to get a few chuckles and a subtle cringe from me, but that night, I simply said, "Can you clarify which part is overanalyzing?" The group went silent for a second. He blinked. Well, you know, the part where you... Never mind." I kept my tone calm, neutral. "I still don't see it. Could you explain it?" There was a pause. One of the friends finally muttered, "I guess he's trying to be funny?" Exactly. He was trying and failing. That pattern repeated again and again over the next few weeks. Every time he tried to get a reaction, I stripped it away. He tried his usual charm and speed, hoping that blur of words would push me into an automatic response. But I didn't. I asked him to explain each comment step by step with calm, measured responses. I could see the frustration growing. He had no script for this. He had no audience. The group laughter that used to validate him disappeared. He stumbled through phrases, repeated himself, and eventually, in some cases, gave up mid-comment. What was fascinating and satisfying was the way the room changed too. Other people who had been unconsciously complicit in his little routine started noticing the cracks. They'd glance at each other, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Some of the more socially aware friends began subtly shifting the topic, cutting his power further. The jokes that were once predictable became awkward and uncomfortable. One evening, it reached a peak. We were at a friend's birthday dinner. He tried one of his classic lines. "Careful, don't let him start explaining the menu. He'll turn it into a whole lecture." I looked up calmly and said, "Could you specify which part of my behavior counts as a lecture?" The room went quiet. Even the birthday friend, usually quick with a laugh, looked at him oddly. He tried to speed through it. "You know, the whole thing." "No, I don't know. Can you be more specific?" And just like that, he froze. The room's energy shifted. His confident smirk disappeared. He muttered something under his breath, tried another joke, and again, no reaction from me. The discomfort in the room was palpable. By the end of the night, he had started to realize something fundamental. His humor depended entirely on predictable responses. Once those responses vanished, the whole system collapsed. At work events, group hangouts, casual meetups, I became the unreadable one. No longer the target, no longer the punchline. People started noticing, he started noticing, and over time the shift became undeniable. He tried to regain control, of course. He sped up his jokes, doubled down on sarcasm, made exaggerated gestures, but nothing worked. I remained calm, neutral, methodical. He eventually began to hesitate before speaking, realizing that his usual approach no longer had an effect. The subtle victory was immensely satisfying. I didn't need to confront him directly. I didn't need to call him out. I didn't even need anyone else to validate what I was doing. The simple act of refusing to react destroyed his system. I realized something crucial. The power in these situations is not about being funny, clever, or witty. It's about the reactions you can elicit. Remove the reaction, remove the control. That was the secret I discovered. And as weeks turned into months, it became a habit. Every time he tried, I remained calm, measured, and literal. I asked clarifying questions. I sought specificity. I forced him to articulate what he meant. And slowly, inexorably, his pattern began to vanish. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment where he finally broke down. But over time, his attempts diminished. He learned, almost unconsciously, that his usual jokes would no longer work. And in social situations, he began targeting others instead. I never gloated. I never needed to. The lesson was already clear. By the end of that year-long cycle, the dynamic had completely flipped. I was no longer the punchline. I had reclaimed control of my social presence. And more importantly, I had learned the power of composure, of refusing to play the game someone else wants to play. At first, I followed the standard advice you hear for dealing with people like this. Ignore it, laugh it off, deflect, throw a joke back. I tried it all. I even went out of my way to be nonchalant, trying to blend in like it didn't bother me. But none of it worked. Not really. Because the jokes weren't the point. My reactions were the point. If I got annoyed, if I rolled my eyes, if I even smiled faintly while bracing myself, he had won. That little burst of laughter, the fleeting approval from the group, that was his currency. It was subtle, and at first I wasn't even fully aware of the pattern. It took weeks to notice, months to accept, and by the time it clicked, I realized I had been responding exactly the way he wanted me to. Each laugh, each slight grimace, each defensive quip, that was fuel. And it happened everywhere. At lunch, in Zoom meetings, during casual game nights, even over text sometimes. Every scenario gave him a platform, and like clockwork, he used it. I tried confronting him once, quietly, in private. I said, "Hey, can we just dial it down a bit?" He smiled like I was joking. "I'm just kidding, come on." And that was it. Nothing changed. Later, in front of the group, he'd resume exactly the same pattern, now with a subtle addition. A knowing glance at me, a nod at someone else, a tone that implied, "Don't bother trying to stop me. It's a joke." After months of this, I realized that I couldn't win by playing the expected game. Laughing along didn't help, reacting angrily didn't help, even ignoring him didn't help, because the moment I tried to show control over my reaction, he'd adapt and keep testing. It wasn't about the jokes themselves, it was the ritual, the social currency he accrued from everyone else watching me squirm or stumble over a response. And honestly, it was exhausting. So, one night, after another long evening of group hangouts where he managed to slip in multiple jabs, I sat back and thought, why am I letting this happen? Not just the jokes, the way he manipulated the room, the way he forced everyone else to participate in his little game. And then I had a realization. The only way to stop this was to change my response entirely. Not to argue, not to laugh, not to deflect, just completely neutral. The next time he tried it, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I didn't plan to make a scene. I didn't plan to humiliate him. I didn't even plan to talk about it afterwards. I just had to completely strip his jokes of their power. And the only way to do that was simple. Refuse to react the way he expected. The first opportunity came sooner than I anticipated. It was a casual evening, a small birthday gathering at a friend's place. He leaned in as usual, the smirk already forming. "Whoa, someone's sensitive today," he said, a comment that would normally get the room laughing instantly. Instead of rolling my eyes or giving a sarcastic quip, I responded calmly, softly, slowly. What exactly did I say that sounded emotional? The room went quiet. The air shifted. Everyone had expected the usual punchline, the grimace, the eye roll, maybe a defensive joke, and instead got calm logic. He tried to recover immediately. "Dude, relax, it's just a joke." "Okay, can you explain which part is funny?" I didn't get it. That silence, it was exquisite. The group didn't know how to react. His smirk faltered. A few laughs tried to escape, but the timing was off. He doubled down, added more. After months of practicing this new approach, I started noticing something I hadn't expected. Not only was he losing control, but the group dynamics were changing too. Friends who used to giggle along with him were no longer participating in his routine. They didn't need to laugh at my expense anymore, because the tension had evaporated. It was subtle at first, a pause before a joke, a nervous glance around the table. But I noticed every tiny shift. People started looking at their phones during his comments, changing topics mid-sentence, or just quietly ignoring him. It was fascinating to watch, like seeing a carefully constructed machine slowly unravel when one key cog stopped turning. He noticed it too. That was the best part. At first, he doubled down. He sped up his delivery, tried louder jokes, exaggerated gestures, and even began to tag other people in the group to validate his humor. But nothing worked. My calm, literal responses were like a mirror, reflecting back his attempts for exactly what they were: empty, manipulative, and ineffective. One evening, at a casual weekend hangout at someone's house, he tried his usual approach. "Watch out, he's going to turn explaining the rules into a 45-minute lecture again." I looked up, neutral, calm. "Which specific part of explaining counts as a lecture? Could you give an example?" The room went quiet. He blinked. Well, you know, the thing." I waited. "I don't know. Could you clarify what you mean by that?" It was the first time I saw him visibly falter. He tried to laugh it off, nervously, but the effect was gone. The usual ripple of laughter didn't happen. A few people shifted uncomfortably, glancing around, and someone even changed the conversation entirely. From that moment on, I realized that the real victory wasn't in winning a single encounter. It was in creating an environment where his behavior no longer had an impact. He wasn't just failing at getting a reaction from me. He was failing to maintain the image he had built over months. The subtle unraveling continued over weeks. At group dinners, at casual meetups, even at birthdays, he would start a joke and immediately hesitate mid-line, unsure whether it would land. That hesitation was all it took. He tried to adapt, trying longer explanations or exaggerated stories to get a laugh, but it only made the room more awkward. The group had learned, almost without realizing it, that the jokes no longer carried the same social weight. And there was a strange sense of satisfaction in observing this. Not the gloating kind, but the quiet, internal acknowledgement that the system he relied on for social dominance had finally failed. The power was no longer in his hands, and he was forced to face that reality. One night, during a casual board game night, he tried something different. He aimed a joke at someone else, thinking that if he couldn't get me, he could regain attention elsewhere. But even then, the effect was diminished. People were no longer on autopilot, laughing reflexively. The dynamic had shifted. The room wasn't his stage anymore. It was a space where reactions were conscious, deliberate, and no longer automatically validating him. At that moment, I realized something crucial. This wasn't just about me anymore. My calm approach had changed the entire social ecosystem around him. People weren't laughing at my expense. People weren't giving him power. And slowly but surely, he was losing his grip. By the end of that year, the change was undeniable. The once confident, dominating personality had become hesitant,
self-conscious, and increasingly irrelevant in group situations. My method, simple, quiet, and consistent, had dismantled a behavior pattern that had persisted for nearly a year without confrontation or aggression. The most satisfying part wasn't the attention he lost. It wasn't the awkward moments he endured. It wasn't even the subtle glances of acknowledgement from friends who had witnessed the transformation. It was the realization that power in social situations isn't about humor, wit, or charisma. It's about control. And once control is removed, the entire system collapses. And I had removed his control entirely. By the time the following months rolled around, the change was unmistakable. He had gone from the unchallenged center of attention in almost every gathering to someone who hesitated before speaking. You could see the thought process racing through his mind. Will this land? Will they laugh? Will I get that reaction? And that hesitation, that split-second doubt, was all it took to unravel the entire persona he had built. It started small. At first, he would preface jokes with, "I don't know if this will be funny," or "Maybe you'll all think this is dumb." He was trying to protect himself from the awkwardness he knew might come if the joke fell flat, but the protection failed. People were no longer automatically laughing. Some friends glanced at each other silently, waiting to see what would happen, while others just changed the topic entirely. The old rhythm of his dominance was gone. At one birthday gathering, I watched it unfold in real time. He began one of his classic quips, the same line he had used countless times over the past year, aiming to make me the punchline again. But before he even finished, I calmly asked him to clarify which part of his comment was supposed to be funny. Silence. A few seconds of shifting eyes, nervous laughter that didn't reach anyone's real amusement. He tried to recover mid-sentence, throwing in more words, gesturing wildly, trying to coax a laugh from anyone, but it didn't work. He looked around, panic starting to creep into his expression, realizing that his tried and true method was failing spectacularly. The pattern repeated over weeks and months. Every time he tried to reclaim the spotlight, every time he attempted to resume the old routine, it fell flat. He started picking smaller targets or trying jokes that weren't directed at me, but even then, the energy had shifted. People no longer reflexively participated in his performances. They were conscious, aware, and unwilling to validate his attempts at social dominance. There was a strange sense of satisfaction in observing this. Not the gloating kind, but the quiet, internal acknowledgement that the system he relied on for social dominance had finally failed. The power was no longer in his hands, and he was forced to face that reality. One night, during a casual board game night, he tried something different. He aimed a joke at someone else, thinking that if he couldn't get me, he could regain attention elsewhere. But even then, the effect was diminished. People were no longer on autopilot, laughing reflexively. The dynamic had shifted. The room wasn't his stage anymore. It was a space where reactions were conscious, deliberate, and no longer automatically validating him. At that moment, I realized something crucial. This wasn't just about me anymore. My calm approach had changed the entire social ecosystem around him. People weren't laughing at my expense. People weren't giving him power. And slowly but surely, he was losing his grip. By the end of that year, the change was undeniable. The once confident, dominating personality had become hesitant, self-conscious, and increasingly irrelevant in group situations. My method, simple, quiet, and consistent, had dismantled a behavior pattern that had persisted for nearly a year without confrontation or aggression. The most satisfying part wasn't the attention he lost. It wasn't the awkward moments he endured. It wasn't even the subtle glances of acknowledgement from friends who had witnessed the transformation. It was the realization that power in social situations isn't about humor, wit, or charisma. It's about control. And once control is removed, the entire system collapses. And I had removed his control entirely. By the time the following months rolled around, the change was unmistakable. He had gone from the unchallenged center of attention in almost every gathering to someone who hesitated before speaking. You could see the thought process racing through his mind. Will this land? Will they laugh? Will I get that reaction? And that hesitation, that split-second doubt, was all it took to unravel the entire persona he had built. It started small. At first, he would preface jokes with, "I don't know if this will be funny," or "Maybe you'll all think this is dumb." He was trying to protect himself from the awkwardness he knew might come if the joke fell flat, but the protection failed. People were no longer automatically laughing. Some friends glanced at each other silently, waiting to see what would happen, while others just changed the topic entirely. The old rhythm of his dominance was gone. At one birthday gathering, I watched it unfold in real time. He began one of his classic quips, the same line he had used countless times over the past year, aiming to make me the punchline again. But before he even finished, I calmly asked him to clarify which part of his comment was supposed to be funny. Silence. A few seconds of shifting eyes, nervous laughter that didn't reach anyone's real amusement. He tried to recover mid-sentence, throwing in more words, gesturing wildly, trying to coax a laugh from anyone, but it didn't work. He looked around, panic starting to creep into his expression, realizing that his tried and true method was failing spectacularly. The pattern repeated over weeks and months. Every time he tried to reclaim the spotlight, every time he attempted to resume the old routine, it fell flat. He started picking smaller targets or trying jokes that weren't directed at me, but even then, the energy had shifted. People no longer reflexively participated.
By this point, the change in group dynamics wasn't subtle anymore. It was undeniable. The guy who had spent nearly a year making me the punchline was now second-guessing himself every time he opened his mouth. I had observed this kind of social manipulation for months, so I could see the pattern. The more he failed to get a reaction, the more his confidence eroded, and the more hesitant he became. It was fascinating to watch, almost like seeing a carefully constructed social structure collapse brick by brick. The first noticeable shift came at a weekend hangout. He tried his usual line, aimed at me, "Careful, don't overthink this, you'll turn it into a whole lecture." I looked at him calmly and asked, which part specifically would be considered overthinking? A pause, a slight hitch in his tone, then a nervous laugh. He tried to continue, doubling down on the joke. I interrupted calmly, "I still don't understand. Can you clarify what you mean?" The reaction from the group was immediate. Silence. A few friends glanced at one another. One friend, normally quick to laugh, shifted the topic entirely. He was now speaking into a void. And that, more than anything, sealed the shift. After that night, the behavior started to generalize. The next time he attempted a dig at someone else, the room didn't respond the way it used to. Laughter didn't follow. People became conscious of what was happening. They started actively refusing to participate in the subtle power plays he had relied on for so long. Even his attempts at charm and exaggeration no longer carried the weight they once did. It was mesmerizing. Watching someone who had seemed untouchable slowly flounder without the group's support revealed a lot about how these social games worked. The jokes were never really about humor. They were about control, predictability, and a sense of superiority. Remove the predictability, remove the reaction, and the whole act crumbles. One of the most telling moments happened during a birthday gathering a few weeks later. He attempted a long, multi-step joke, weaving in details, gestures, and pauses for effect. Normally, this would have brought the room to life. Everyone would have laughed, and I would have involuntarily reacted in some way, giving him the boost he craved. But that night, I calmly asked, "Could you clarify which part of your story is supposed to be funny?" He froze. His timing faltered. The group shifted uncomfortably. A few people glanced at each other. Nobody laughed. He tried to recover, repeating himself, gesturing more dramatically, but it was too late. The spell was broken. The room no longer responded automatically, and he realized it. By the end of the night, he was quiet, tentative. The confidence that had allowed him to dominate social situations for months was gone. Over the next few months, the transformation became permanent.
He stopped targeting me. He tried smaller jokes on others, but even there, the group's response was different. People no longer reinforced his humor. The social ecosystem had changed entirely, and I had been the catalyst. It wasn't about humiliation or revenge in the traditional sense. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public shaming. The shift happened quietly, methodically, and without anyone outside the group noticing the mechanics behind it. And that, to me, was the most satisfying part. I learned a lot from this process. The first lesson, power in social situations comes from predictable responses. If you can control your own reactions, you take away someone else's influence. The second lesson, change doesn't need to be loud or aggressive. Small, consistent actions like calmly asking for clarification can completely disrupt a manipulative system. By refusing to play the role he expected, I had rewritten the social rules. And the funny thing, the other friends started to notice. They started to engage with me differently, with more respect and awareness. The old hierarchy had shifted. The final stage of this process was almost anticlimactic. He tried one last time at a game night several months later, a minor joke aimed subtly, designed to provoke a reaction. I responded the same way I had for the past year, calm, literal, and neutral. No reaction. He faltered, realized it wasn't working, and gave up mid-sentence. That was it. That was the moment where the pattern fully ended. He didn't need to be confronted, he didn't need to apologize, and no one had to intervene. The social structure itself had corrected, and he was no longer in control. From that point forward, I realized the full power of what I had accomplished. Not only had I stopped being the punchline, but I had also shifted the social dynamic permanently. Everyone became more conscious, more aware, and more careful about how they treated each other. And I learned something personally, too. I didn't need to be reactive to take back my power. Calmness, clarity, and consistency can dismantle even the most persistent social manipulations. It was subtle, quiet, and completely effective. By now, the shift in the group was unmistakable. He had spent nearly a year building a reputation, a sort of social dominance that relied entirely on predictable reactions. But now, that dominance was gone. Every time he tried to make a joke, to get the room laughing at my expense, it fell flat. People didn't automatically respond anymore, and the confidence he had once carried into every gathering started to crumble. He tried to adapt at first, of course. He would preface his jokes with hedges, trying to protect himself from failure. Maybe this isn't funny, or I don't know if anyone will get this. He sped up his delivery, gestured more wildly, exaggerated his expressions, all in an attempt to recapture the power he had lost. Nothing worked. The room had changed, and the responses he relied on for reinforcement were no longer there. One night, during a small group dinner, he attempted one of his classic digs at me. The line was long, built up with gestures and pauses designed to maximize effect. I calmly asked him, step by step, which part of the comment was supposed to be funny. Each clarification request forced him to articulate what he meant, and each articulation made the joke weaker. The pauses became longer, the stammers more noticeable, the confidence visibly evaporating. He tried once more to regain control by targeting someone else, hoping that if he couldn't provoke me, he could still dominate the room. But even that failed. People were now conscious of the dynamics. They no longer laughed reflexively, no longer gave him the attention he craved. The social ecosystem had adjusted. His humor depended entirely on compliance, and the compliance was gone. Over time, it became a pattern. Every attempt he made to assert dominance or create a laugh at someone else's expense failed. Not because people actively stopped him, not because I interfered, but because the predictable responses he relied on were no longer there. He had built his persona around reactions I refused to give, and eventually there were no reactions left. I didn't celebrate or call attention to it. I didn't mock him or make a scene. I simply continued my approach, calm, neutral, literal. Each interaction reinforced the message. The system he had depended on to manipulate social situations no longer existed, and in that quiet, methodical way, I reclaimed control of my own social presence. The group itself began to respond differently. Friends who had been unconsciously complicit in his humor stopped reinforcing it. They engaged consciously, redirecting conversations, shifting topics, refusing to provide validation for attempts at dominance. The entire dynamic had shifted without anyone having to confront him directly. Months passed, and he became quieter, more tentative, almost socially invisible compared to his former presence. He no longer aimed jokes at me, and his attempts at humor elsewhere had lost their impact. He realized, perhaps subconsciously, that the rules had changed, and his usual methods no longer worked. It was a lesson in quiet power. I had achieved the goal without confrontation, without drama, without aggression. Simply by refusing to react, by remaining consistent and clear, I had dismantled a pattern that had lasted nearly a year. And the most remarkable part was how it affected everyone else. The group became more conscious, more respectful, and more aware of each other's boundaries. My calm, literal approach had shifted not only my own position, but the entire social dynamic. People were no longer passive participants in social manipulation, they were engaged and aware. Looking back, it became clear that the real victory wasn't about humiliating him or proving a point. The real victory was reclaiming control of my own reactions, taking away someone else's power without needing to fight, and subtly transforming the environment around me. It was quiet, methodical, and profoundly satisfying. Eventually, his presence in the group normalized. He stopped attempting to dominate conversations, no longer relied on predictable reactions, and no longer treated others as punchlines. The cycle that had lasted a year finally ended, and I realized the value of consistency and composure in navigating manipulative social situations. And in that quiet, controlled way, I had won, not with drama, not with anger, but with clarity, patience, and calm.
By the time the next few months rolled around, his attempts had become almost laughable, though of course I didn't give him the satisfaction of noticing. He tried to reclaim the spotlight occasionally, but it was like watching someone try to use a broken tool over and over, hoping it would suddenly work. The room had changed. Friends who used to instinctively react now thought before laughing. Conversations were no longer automatically turned into stages for his little performances. One evening during a casual game night, he started a story designed to be funny at my expense. Normally, the build-up would have had everyone leaning forward waiting for the punchline, while I would have felt that familiar twinge of being the butt of the joke. This time, I calmly asked him to clarify exactly which part was intended to be funny. The room went silent. He floundered, repeated himself, gestured more wildly, but the expected reaction never came. People looked at each other, uncertain whether to laugh, and one friend subtly changed the topic. He stopped mid-story and gave a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. That single pause, that moment of hesitation, spoke volumes. After that night, his attempts became more tentative. Every joke aimed at me or anyone else was prefaced with hedging language. "I don't know if this will make sense," or "maybe you'll think this is silly." The confidence that once radiated from him had drained away. Each joke now required extra effort, extra explanation, and yet the responses he wanted never arrived. His humor had relied on predictability, and without it, his words felt hollow. It was interesting to watch the psychology of it unfold. Each failed attempt chipped away at the persona he had built, forcing him to confront the fact that his control over social situations depended entirely on others' reactions. He had no script for failure, no backup plan for when people stopped playing along. That reliance on others' responses, once a strength, had become his weakness. Meanwhile, the group began to adjust naturally. Friends who had previously laughed along out of habit now felt more conscious of the social dynamics. They began to respond differently, not because they were instructed to, but because the pattern had shifted. Conversations were more genuine, interactions more deliberate. The social ecosystem, once dominated by his predictable manipulations, had been recalibrated. There were still moments of awkwardness. He would stumble over words, attempt jokes that didn't land, or look around nervously for validation that never came. But each time, the room responded the same way: calm, measured, neutral. Over time, these repeated failures reinforced the new social order. People stopped treating him as the center of attention by default, and he adjusted, slowly withdrawing from trying to dominate interactions. One particularly telling night was during a casual birthday celebration. He attempted a joke, carefully crafted, building up tension and anticipation. I calmly asked him to explain which part was funny. Silence. Nervous laughter that didn't reach anyone. Friends exchanged glances. The joke collapsed under its own weight, and he realized, finally, fully, that the method that had served him so well for months no longer worked. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it was complete. He stopped trying to target me. His jokes became smaller, more hesitant, less frequent. He no longer attempted to dominate conversations. Even when he did speak, he seemed aware that the room would not automatically validate him. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. What had started as a personal strategy to protect myself had grown into something broader. By refusing to participate in his manipulative patterns, I had not only reclaimed control over my own social space, but also influenced the environment around me. Friends became more conscious of each other's reactions, more deliberate in their interactions, and less likely to tolerate manipulative humor. The lessons were clear. First, social power often relies on predictable reactions. Second, consistency and calmness can dismantle even the most persistent manipulations. Third, transformation doesn't require confrontation, anger, or dramatic gestures. Small, deliberate actions, like asking for clarification, staying neutral, and refusing to provide the reaction someone expects, can have profound and lasting effects. By the end of that period, the shift was permanent. He no longer had influence over the group, and the social hierarchy had changed. The lessons I had learned were invaluable, not just for that specific situation, but for understanding group dynamics and the nature of influence itself. And through it all, I remained composed. I never gloated. I never highlighted his failures. I simply observed, stayed consistent, and let the natural consequences of his reliance on predictable reactions play out. It was quietly satisfying to see the power he once wielded dissolve without confrontation, without drama, and without me needing to act beyond maintaining my composure. The ultimate reward wasn't embarrassment or revenge, it was control. The realization that I had reclaimed my own space, redefined the social dynamic, and created a group environment where manipulative humor no longer had power. That was a victory that lasted far longer than any single joke, gathering, or birthday party. By now, the change in the group was complete. The guy who had spent nearly a year making me the butt of every joke no longer had the influence he once did. He had learned, slowly and painfully, that his humor relied entirely on predictable reactions, and once those reactions disappeared, so did his control. Every attempt to regain attention or provoke laughter was met with calm, neutral responses that stripped him of his power. The first few times he tried to pivot and target others, it became obvious to everyone around him that the effect was diminished. Friends who had previously laughed reflexively began to recognize the pattern. They realized the jokes weren't actually funny, they were manipulative. Without the automatic laughter to feed him, his humor felt forced, awkward, and, most importantly, powerless. At a casual weekend gathering, he leaned in to deliver a joke, exaggerated hand gestures, the same confident smirk he had relied on for months. I calmly asked, "Could you clarify which part is supposed to be funny?" Silence. Nervous laughter that didn't reach anyone. Friends exchanged glances. The joke collapsed under its own weight, and he sat back, visibly unsettled. That night, the pattern finally crystallized in his mind. His influence was gone. The more he failed, the more tentative he became. His jokes grew shorter, his timing slower, his expressions less confident. He began to hedge every line with disclaimers, attempting to protect himself from failure. "I don't know if this will make sense," or "maybe you'll think this is silly." But even that didn't help. Without the reaction he relied on, the words themselves lost their impact. Over time, the group adapted. Friends became more deliberate in their interactions. They
They were no longer passive participants in manipulative humor. Conversations became genuine rather than performative. Everyone became aware of the dynamics at play, and the space that he once dominated was no longer under his control. At work events, group hangouts, or birthday parties, any attempt to make me the punchline failed consistently. Even when he targeted others, the room's responses had changed. Laughter no longer reinforced his attempts at dominance. Social control was no longer in his hands, and he had no backup plan. Every failed joke was a reminder that the old system no longer existed. The subtle victories accumulated. Each moment where his humor fell flat reinforced the new dynamic. Each pause, stammer, or forced smile chipped away at his confidence. Slowly but surely, he learned that the predictable reactions he relied on were gone, and with them, his social power had vanished. One night, during a casual board game night, he attempted an elaborate joke, carefully crafted, building up tension and anticipation. I calmly asked him to explain which part was funny. Silence. Nervous laughter that didn't reach anyone. Friends exchanged glances. The joke collapsed under its own weight, and he sat back, visibly unsettled. That night, the pattern finally crystallized in his mind. His influence was gone. The process wasn't dramatic. There were no confrontations, no shouting matches, no public humiliation. It was quiet, methodical, and effective. By maintaining calm, consistency, and clarity, I had dismantled a year-long pattern of manipulative social manipulation without raising my voice or creating conflict. Over the following months, the social landscape stabilized. He spoke less, attempted fewer jokes, and no longer targeted me or anyone else with manipulative humor. Friends, now more aware, engaged differently, redirecting conversations when necessary and refusing to reinforce outdated patterns. The entire group dynamic had shifted permanently. The lessons were profound. Social power often relies on predictable reactions, and by refusing to provide them, control can be neutralized. Consistency and calmness are more effective than confrontation or anger. Small, deliberate actions, like asking for clarification, staying neutral, and refusing to provide the reaction someone expects, can have profound and lasting effects.
By this stage, everything had settled into a new normal. Not the kind of dramatic ending people expect in stories like this. No final confrontation, no apology speech, no big moment where everyone suddenly realizes what happened. Instead, it was quieter than that, more real. If you walked into one of our hangouts at that point, you wouldn't notice anything unusual. Conversations flowed normally, people laughed, joked, shared stories. It felt natural. But if you had been there months earlier, you'd notice the difference immediately. The edge was gone. That underlying tension, the one where you knew someone might become the punchline at any moment, had completely disappeared. And him? He was still there. Just different. He talked less. Not in a sad or isolated way, but in a measured way. Like someone who had learned the hard way that words have consequences. Every now and then he'd still try to make a joke, but now there was hesitation, a pause, a quick glance around the room before he said anything. That pause said everything, because before, he never needed it. There was one moment that really stuck with me. We were sitting around at a small dinner. Nothing special, just a normal night. Someone brought up a topic that months ago would have been the perfect setup for one of his usual comments about me. You could almost see it forming in his mind. The setup, the delivery, the expectation. He even leaned forward slightly like he used to. Then he stopped. Just stopped. He looked at me for a second, then back at the group, and instead of making the joke, he said something completely normal. That was it. That was the moment. Not loud, not dramatic, but final. Because it meant he understood, fully. His thing only worked when people played along, and now no one was playing anymore. I didn't say anything, didn't react, didn't even acknowledge it, because I didn't need to. By then, the point had already been made.
What surprised me the most wasn't just how he changed, it was how everyone else changed too. People became more aware, more careful, not in a tense or uncomfortable way, just more respectful. Jokes were still there, but they were different, lighter, shared, not at someone's expense. And if someone did cross a line, you could feel the shift instantly. Not because anyone called it out, but because people didn't respond the same way anymore. That automatic laughter? Gone. Which meant the behavior didn't get rewarded, which meant it didn't continue. Simple as that. At some point, one of my friends mentioned it casually, not directly about him, just in general. "Things feel different lately," he said. I just nodded, because I knew exactly why. But I didn't explain it. Didn't need to. The change spoke for itself. Looking back now, the whole thing taught me something I didn't expect. At the start, I thought I had two choices: react or stay quiet, fight back or ignore it. Turns out there was a third option. Don't play the game at all. No anger, no sarcasm, no trying to win in the moment. Just remove what the other person is trying to get, the reaction. And once that's gone, everything else falls apart on its own. It wasn't instant. It wasn't easy at first either. There were moments where it felt awkward, moments where the silence stretched a little too long. But those moments, they were necessary. Because that discomfort, that's what breaks the pattern. And once the pattern is broken, it doesn't come back the same way. By the end of it all, there was no need for closure, no final conversation, no lesson learned speech, just a quiet shift, a new normal. And honestly, that made it even better. Because it wasn't forced, it wasn't artificial, it was real, and it lasted. What stayed with me long after everything settled wasn't just what happened, it was how simple the shift actually was. For almost a year, I thought I had to manage him, adjust to him, work around him. I thought the problem was his behavior, but it wasn't. The real problem was the loop. He says something, people react, he gets rewarded, he does it again, over and over. And without realizing it, I had been part of that loop. Not because I wanted to be, but because I reacted the way anyone normally would. Once I saw that clearly, everything changed. Because if the loop needs a reaction to survive, then removing the reaction breaks it. That's it. No big strategy, no confrontation, just consistency. Looking back now, the most powerful part wasn't just what I said, it was how I said it. No emotion, no sarcasm, no trying to embarrass him, just calm questions. Simple, direct, and patient. What do you mean by that? Can you explain it? I don't get the joke. On the surface, those sound small, almost harmless, but in reality, they do something very specific. They force the other person to step out of performance mode and into explanation mode. And once someone has to explain a joke like that, it loses all its power. Because most of the time, there was nothing there to explain. It was never about humor. It was about timing, tone, and reaction. And without those, there's nothing left. What made it work wasn't doing it once. It was doing it every time. No exceptions, no slipping back into old habits. Because the moment you react the old way, the loop starts again. So I stayed consistent, even when it felt awkward, even when the room got quiet, even when part of me wanted to just laugh it off and move on. I didn't. And that consistency is what changed everything. The funny part is, I didn't just learn how to deal with him, I learned something bigger. This kind of dynamic shows up everywhere. Work, friends, family, different people, same pattern. Someone pushes a little, gets a reaction, pushes again. And most people either fight it or tolerate it. But very few people just step out of it completely. That's the difference. You don't always need to push back harder. Sometimes you just need to stop giving the other person what they're looking for. And when you do that calmly, without making it a big deal, it forces a change, whether they realize it or not. And as for him, we still crossed paths after that. Things were normal, respectful, neutral. No tension, no leftover weirdness, just different. He never brought it up. I didn't either, because there was nothing to say. The behavior stopped. The dynamic changed. That was enough. And honestly, that's what made it satisfying. Not revenge, not embarrassment. Control. Not over him, over myself. That's what shifted everything. Because once you control your reaction, nobody else can control the situation the same way again. And once you experience that, you don't forget it. You carry it into every room, every conversation, every interaction. Quietly, without needing to prove anything. And that's the real ending. No big scene, no dramatic finish, just a simple truth. Some people only have power because you respond the way they expect. Change that, and the whole game disappears.